Hello everyone and welcome to our first critical conversations of the new academic year, which is very exciting. Critical Conversations is an event which allows us to have the discussions about the critical issues that museums face, and often, as definitely is the case with tonight's discussion, that society at large faces too. So just as a little bit of housekeeping, if you click the three dots in the top of your screen, you can activate live captions. So if you'd like that for the event tonight, you can do that. And you will also see that there is a Q&A function on your screen, so that if you would like to ask any questions of the panel tonight, then that is also totally fine. And we encourage you to do so. There's lots of questions that can be raised from this discussion, so we hope that you will do that. So I'm Eilidh, I'm the Assistant Learning and Access Curator at the University Museums here in St Andrews, and I'm joined by three wonderful panellists this evening who I will introduce you to in just a moment. So tonight we're here to talk all about the issue of greenwashing. And this is a term that we will explain in just a few short moments. The reason that we're having this discussion this evening is because we at the Wardlaw Museum are opening a new exhibition this Friday, which is very exciting. It's called Dive In, Protecting Our Ocean. And we have in our strategic plan for the museums really sort of focused on the climate emergency, and we have said that we're going to respond to the climate emergency and build sustainability into everything we do. Dive In is a really big part of this, as is sort of working with the UN sustainability goals and auditing our work and all of those sorts of things. So we're really, as a museum service, trying to make these really important steps towards being a much more sustainable organisation. So here is where the conversation of greenwashing comes in, because we're going to speak a lot about corporate social responsibility and all of those things this evening, and we hope that this conversation will have lots of takeaways for the museums as to what we can be doing to make sure that we're a more sustainable organisation and that we don't fall into the trap of greenwashing. So if possible, I would love to introduce our lovely panellists for this evening. Can I pass over to you first, Lucy?
Absolutely. Let me just unmute myself. My name is Dr Lucy Wishart. I am an associate lecturer in the School of Management at the university.
Excellent. And maybe yourself next, Samuel?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi everyone, I'm Sam Woolhead. I'm the project officer with Transition University of St Andrews.
And last but not least, Mia.
Hi, I can only apologise for the fact that my webcam decides to not want to work today, but I'm Mia and I'm a second year PhD student and I'm joint supervised in the Schools of English and International Relations.
Thank you very much. And don't worry about tech issues. I think if there's one thing that we've all grown used to over the course of the last year and a half, it's technology not working when we want it to. So no worries at all. Yeah, fantastic. So what I wondered if we can maybe do first, Sam, if I could pass to you, is just to give our attendees a little bit of an insight into what greenwashing is. What is this term that we're using to describe this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a term that's been used a lot more widely in recent years. And I guess to sum it up best, I'm going to use Zero Waste Scotland's definition, which is that companies are exaggerating or fabricating their green credentials to capitalize on a growing demand for environmental products. And I think this has become an increasingly big issue simply just because as climate emergencies have been declared across institutions, governments, countries, there's a massive push for people to not only engage with it on a political level, but also on an individual level. And that's where our capitalist and society and our consumption behaviors come into show quite clearly. And so it's definitely an insidiousness to it, which kind of makes it all the more necessary to open up these conversations about. I can go on a little bit more, but I didn't know if I should leave this open for conversation at a later point, because I'm sure it's just a never ending.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those things that I would say that's a very good summary of what we're chatting about this evening. I think we might go on to sort of talk about the term greenwashing a little bit in terms of greenwashing by organisations, and then greenwashing is personal greenwashing a thing? Let's find out, shall we? Let's continue this conversation. Lucy, it would be really interesting to come to you next, and maybe if you could give us a bit of a background as to your research into corporate social responsibility around these issues. I think that would be really interesting to give a bit of context to, yeah, what greenwashing is.
So I'm super pleased that Sam has started us off with a definition from Zero Waste Scotland, because really that's the kind of research area that I'm interested in, is the concept of zero waste and the idea of zero waste, and how companies use the phrase zero waste I think is really interesting, and I'll try and maybe use that as an example throughout as I sort of explain where greenwashing comes in corporate social responsibility. So when we think of corporate social responsibility, we are very often thinking of profit-making organisations. But I think a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight really do apply to all organisations, which is why it's an interesting conversation to have in respect of the work of the museum. But when organisations, particularly organisations that make money, operate in society, we're giving them a licence to operate. We say it's okay for you to make money in society, but it's only okay for you to make money in these terms. And so when the organisation is operating, we want to hold them accountable, and we want to hold them accountable in particular terms. And that's really where the environment has I guess, played a big role in corporate communications. So we want organisations and commercial organisations to tell us what their impact on the environment is. And then we can decide whether we want to engage with that organisation, whether we want to change regulations or rules in order to limit the impact of the environment. But alongside that has come this kind of, at the same time, I suppose, idea that actually organisations that are doing something positive for the environment, it brings benefits to that organisation. So we start to see that organisation more positively. And that's where the interesting issue around zero waste comes in, because if we start to see an organisation more positively, then they potentially sell more things. They potentially have a bigger impact in terms of the amount of I guess their size, and so they'll have a bigger impact. So that's where we start to see that kind of murky idea that comes in with greenwashing in. But also because organisations are seen more favourably when they're environmentally friendly, then that means that there's an incentive suddenly, not just to report on the environmental impact of your company, but also the positive things that your company is doing in relation to the environment. And sometimes that's great. So if we look at things like a big organisation like H&M produces a huge corporate social responsibility report every year, and that has changed some aspects of H&M's business. They have more organic clothing, they might have more recycled clothing as part of what they're selling. But fundamentally, when we look at H&M's business model, it isn't that sustainable. Its business model is built on selling a lot of things. We see that probably, or that ambiguity or paradox is probably a more accurate way to describe it. We see that paradox most when you look at their return system. So H&M has a system where you can return clothes to the shop. In the past, they used to give you some money off new clothes by returning your old clothes to the shop. And in one way, yes, that is closing a loop. It's ensuring that waste, that clothing doesn't go to landfill. But it's not doing anything about encouraging the consumption at the other end. And so that's a great example where you start to see that paradox. Where that creates a bigger issue, I suppose, is where it's not just a paradox, the stuff that the company's doing, but where there's actual, as Sam said, sort of subterfuge or insidious, some sort of insidious, well, insidious is maybe too hard a word, but at least there's the company's not being completely transparent with what they're doing. An example of that recently in relation to ocean sustainability might be Adidas, who had made a big thing about creating and being part of a partnership where their trainers were made of ocean waste. And it actually turned out that the story that they were telling gave this idea that the waste was being taken from the ocean to make the trainer. But actually, a little bit of investigation found out that the waste had never been in the ocean. The plastic had never made it into the ocean. The plastic had come from sort of they were saving plastic that they thought might end up into the ocean. And that's a bit iffy, isn't it, to say that it's made from ocean waste. And so that has created some real scepticism around environmental messages. And that scepticism is what we quite often call greenwash. But that has real consequences, because not only do we start to doubt all environmental messages, it means that perhaps any organisation that's doing something positive is viewed slightly sceptically, because some people have taken advantage of this positive message that can be seen alongside the environment. I'm going to stop because I wasn't quite as succinct as Sam there. So
no, there were lots of good messages in there.
to chat about it as we go on.
Absolutely. I think the thing that strikes me from all of those discussions is that bit about actually, a lot of this is consumer led, right? The thing is, with brands like H&M, who have thousands and thousands of clothing items on their website and they release new clothing every day, if the demand wasn't there, then that business model wouldn't be sustainable, right? So it's quite interesting that actually, we as individuals, we do have that power to make a difference. And I think that's something that in our exhibition Dive In that's opening this week, we're really sort of focusing on is the power of the individual to actually make a difference. I think the example of fast fashion obviously is quite it's probably the most well-known form of greenwashing, I would hazard a guess. So I wonder whether Mia, at this point, maybe you would like to come in and speak a little bit about the sort of follow up on that discussion about fast fashion. We were speaking quite a lot about tote bags recently, and the issue of tote bags. And I think in the museum sector, we love a tote bag. So it would be really interesting, Mia, if you wanted to pick up on that.
Yes, absolutely. So actually, if I was able to work my webcam right now, what you would be able to see is what I like to call my bag of bags, which is a tote bag filled with tote bags. I counted them today, and that tote bag is filled with 23 different tote bags. I have bought one of those. The rest of them have either been given to me by friends who are desperately trying to get rid of tote bags, or they have been given out at the Freshers' Fair or at various museum events. And they just come your way and you accumulate them. And on one level, this is fantastic because the tote bag has been around really for as long as I can remember. They were a huge part of a kind of teenage identity. You would get a tote bag from your favorite record shop or your favorite independent bookshop, and you almost had tribes associated with them. But they really took off, as kind of from my perspective, with the decline of the plastic carrier bag, because we were being charged for them. We knew that plastic carrier bags were ending up in landfills, so we moved towards a tote bag that was more sustainable, it's stronger, it's repeatedly reusable, and you can wash it. And this is brilliant. But the problem is that when you have 23 of them in the back of your wardrobe, ultimately no one is doing that much shopping in one day. I'd like to think, at least, especially if we're trying to be conscious consumers. And essentially what has very recently come to light, and I believe that it was the New Yorker that actually did the full expose on it, is that but at some point you will be done with this tote bag. The the straps on it will break, it will give way, it will start to disintegrate in the same way that something like a carrier bag would, and they will end up in landfill in the same way. And yes, it will take more years to get there. It's more steps to get there. Maybe they will be passed around your friendship circle as you're all trying to desperately get rid of your 23 tote bags. But ultimately, it is the same effect, but they are sold not only in the museum sector, but like I said, in record shops, in bookshops. Every single kind of independent shop, and even a lot of chain shops and major retailers now market these tote bags. I know that all the supermarkets have their various iterations of the bag for life in different fabrics. And we're flooding the environment with these bags that aren't really that much better. sorry, my voice is also going at the same time, very unhelpful. But essentially, we have this idea where we're almost greenwashing our own identities, and corporations, and not even just large corporations, very individual corporations, are greenwashing themselves with something that is, yes, helpful, and yes, an improvement on what we have seen before, if you want to compare it directly to the plastic bag. But really, are we just putting something in that is not even a temporary relief, but a temporary way to make ourselves feel better about what we're doing for the environment, that isn't necessarily going to have a larger impact in the next 10 to 15 years? And I think it goes back to what both Sam and Lucy articulated really well. There's two sides to this, where you can look at it from a very optimistic point of view, but you can also look at it from quite a cynical point of view. How many of us knew that tote bags weren't really doing that much good for the environment? Can we be optimistic and say that, as the Wardlaw Museum or the museums of St Andrews, we sell 6 different tote bags, but we didn't know? And that's fine, because we think we're doing a good thing. But there's also the cynical side, and we see it in examples of things like Adidas. Maybe we see it when ASOS do a green canvas tote bags that you're meant to use for all of your shopping, or even the net bags for fruit that had a massive rise in sales over lockdown. Is that any better? Are these companies aware of doing this? And you can approach it from both ways. And I think, obviously, we're in a critical conversation. It's right to be critical, and it is right to be cynical to an extent. But I do think we need to maintain the hope and optimism that, is it just a case of more education and less tote bags ultimately?
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? And the thing is with the tote bags, like you say, I honestly don't think, you know, when people started out making tote bags, there probably wasn't any sort of insidious, to hark back to a word, sort of meaning behind it. It was genuinely like, okay, tote bags are sustainable. Here is a sustainable way for me to promote my business, or whatever it might be. Like you say, to cut down on the carrier bag consumption. I certainly am guilty of owning many tote bags also, I have to admit. I think what was really interesting, like you had that you brought up there, Mia, is that idea of personal greenwashing. That was something we alluded to earlier in the conversation. I think, you know, the thing about reuse is good, right? I think both Sam and Lucy and Mia, all of you will agree that reuse is good. And maybe one of you could speak to what is so great about reuse. But then also there is this maybe slightly murkier side to it, where we're all convincing ourselves that we're really sustainable and really green because we all have our reusable water bottles. But maybe we're not. So Sam, if you could maybe speak to the benefits of reuse, given your role as a project officer for transition, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess just to kind of backtrack before getting onto the reuse, I kind of also want to discuss a little bit about what Lucy and Mia talked about, and I think where it comes from is this deeper issue with greenwashing is the fact that there's kind of firstly very little regulation on companies actually selling such products, on what actually a sustainable certification is. There's no control over it, and so this creates a bit of an issue and allows like an open feeding onto this really, really strong desire for people to engage with climate change. And it's from a communicating climate change perspective, there's a really niche, not niche, but there's an interesting kind of situation at hand about framing things in ways to engage with a really diverse range of type of person. So from your progressive activist to your disengaged traditionalist or whatever it is, there is an overwhelming concern about climate change and environmental issues. And by not actually talking to the perspective of these people, we kind of run the risk and where greenwashing is kind of latched onto. It's this like really ambiguous concern to which nobody seems to want to actually sort out at a very strong institution level. So it kind of comes back onto the individual, but then as individuals, we struggle with time. We live in such a high-paced society. We struggle with the ability to find the fight to tackle something as abstract as greenwashing. And we also have this deeper issue, I guess, of a kind of a social disconnect that comes with kind of capitalism. And I guess I'm going to go on a bit more of a a rampant spin against capitalism here, because there's a lot of talk about trying to kind of confront it as a part of a capitalist society, but there's definitely a clear situation here that there's a whole values change that needs to happen. And where I think as individual agents, we struggle to engage with these things firsthand. Often the best solution, in my personal opinion, is to kind of bring things back to a local context as much as possible, which is then kind of going back to transition, going back to St. Andrews, which coincidentally was a project that I know Lucy set up, I believe, or has definitely had a strong hand in. But it's the idea of going things to the local, and through like a transition ethos, it's about the hearts, the head and the hands. So it's about kind of feeling a sort of connection to the issues, to developing a connection with your neighbors. From the head point of view, it's about creating like a logical understanding of the issues at play. And then hands is about getting practical. And underlying all that, there's a bit of a challenging of a sort of dependency on capitalism, and as well as also building a community resilience. And that's through trusting people, that's through an opportunity to even start trusting governments a bit more. And hopefully with that, giving governments a bit more power, or I guess, support, like an allowance, so to speak, to actually go off and start regulating stuff like greenwashing a lot more firmly than it's been done. And so reuse is an example where I think kind of bringing things back to the local level, having a sort of sharing economy context where people are passing things on to each other. We're not going off buying things, like you said, Eilidh, earlier on. It's about cutting back on our demand for new products. It's about actually caring for what we have a lot more, about focusing on the lifespan of things and moving away, not just from companies that are massively problematic in areas such as planned obsolescence, where you find that a lot with technology, but also this issue of perceived obsolescence, where people are buying stuff just because we can, and things that ultimately turn into clutter, turn out of favor to the next purchase or opportunity for retail therapy or whatever the situation is. And all of a sudden, we find that things just go from a sort of a cradle to cradle, so to speak. It's kind of in one, out the other. St. Andrews is an example where, and to be honest, this week we get so many tote bags and plastic bags and stuff come through that I get my sort of momentary anxiety on a week by week basis when I go through our reuse storage. But we kind of collect a lot of things from Halls of Residence. That's specifically where we focus. We have donations that are increasingly coming from students in private accommodation, but also from local residents engaging us as well. And it's become a bit more of a town-wide kind of collaboration. So there's links with other groups such as the St. Andrews Environmental Network that now partner with us. And in these, you can see the certain sort of items that are coming through. It's a real tell about the consumer. So we have a lot of things that are university logoed, museum logoed, the Vic logoed, Mitchells and Forgans logoed. And it feels absolutely absurd. It's not necessary by any means, but these things are about. And to kind of go beyond the sort of tote bag, but where clothes come into play, I think that is for me, I think the hardest bit, because every other item, such as your kitchenware or your drying racks or your coat hangers, so maybe not the coat hangers, but they're things that people need when they move into a new accommodation. So having these passed on from generation to generation of student is a really effective way of reducing the amount that are being bought in on a year. But then when it comes down to actually making a difference and indent on clothes, it just feels like it's such high turnover. People are purchasing brand new faster than they're actually reusing secondhand. And we see that firsthand in St. Andrews. And that's an area of the reuse in which I feel very overwhelmed and inundated. And it's an area where I think is also brought into focus a lot more the need to communicate these issues, or communicate climate change even more broadly, with a lot more sensitivity, to target the people that we're really, really looking to engage with, whether it is a specific kind of a disengaged individual or loyal national, or whoever that sort of segment of UK British society is, or if it's the fact that we're trying to confront specifically first year students that are going in and buying things from Uni Kit Out and H&M. There's lots of plays in there. And so I think definitely looking at the local context for developing agency and engaging with our local institutions, or as local institutions, to be more, I guess, sensitive about communicating these things, can have a really strong and fundamental change to the way that we live in an economy, almost a localized or sharing economy right here, right now.
Absolutely. I think it's fascinating, isn't it, that idea of planned or other sorts of obsolescence. I've actually just finished reading a book by Aja Barber called Consumed, and it was what an eye-opener. It was just published a couple of weeks ago, and one of the examples that she uses quite a lot is the idea of like a slogan t-shirt or a t-shirt from an event or that sort of thing. There's no reuse market for that, right? It's if it says someone's hen party 2017,
anything with a name on it, anything with a date on it, anything with a logo on it, done. Yeah. Never ever getting reused.
You wouldn't,
terrifying.
You wouldn't pick that up in a charity shop, would you? It's just not. Yeah, it's just not on the market. Lucy, I think you're ready to come in on this.
Yeah, hopefully as long you froze for a moment on my screen, so that was maybe where the panic was, rather than the idea of this a huge influx in the market of branded stuff, although that is also, I think, a concern. I'm gonna take it right back to your question about why reuse is good, Eilidh, and talk a little bit about, so Sam alluded to the fact that I was involved in St Andrews as well, and I certainly didn't set it up. It was set up a few years before I took it on, and I see myself more as a kind of custodian for this project that it's just kind of developed organically and grown, but it's always been quite well supported within the town, within the university from when it started. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because reuse is so sensible. The idea of wasting things, throwing things that are perfectly usable away, is something that, it doesn't matter who you are, feels wasteful. And we're taught from a very early age not to be wasteful. And therefore, it seems like a straightforward idea. It's very difficult to find a counterpoint to. It's something that it seems universally positive, and there are very few universally positive ideas in the world, so you can see why people have grabbed a hold of it and kept going with it. One of the difficult things though about universally positive things, or things that in a way become symbolic, I suppose, of good or good practices, is that they don't really allow for the complexity of change that's required to really address the climate crisis. And equally, they don't really allow the complexity of some of the, sorry, you can probably hear my dog in the background. She's having a little roll around on the couch behind me. They don't, those conversations don't really reflect the complexity of the environmental impact that our current structures have. And we do have a huge consequence on the environment in lots of different ways. So what we do is we pick up on symbols and heuristics that present things as environmentally sustainable, because we can't all do life cycle analyses or complex breakdowns of what the environmental impact of something is. And some of the things that have become symbols of environmental sustainability include tote bags, reusable water bottles, reusable coffee cups. And there's a kind of irony there that there's a consumerism view there, that those are also things you buy in order to show yourself as a sustainable person or somebody who cares about the environment. And as Sam will tell you with St Andrews, the irony is there's not much reuse in reusable stuff. You know, people don't want to reuse other people's reusable items. So there's almost no market for reusable cups, reusable or things branded as reusable for whatever reason. But it is allude to the fact that whenever we use anything, whenever we're doing anything, there's quite complex socio-cultural reasons why we don't reuse, why we don't want to engage with particular environmental practices, why we planned obsolescence works, or why planned obsolescence is suddenly, I mean, that's socio-cultural, isn't it? So there's quite a lot here about understanding different relationships to materials, understanding different relationships to symbols, understanding different relationships to things that we maybe don't pay that much attention to because we see them as universally good. And for me, that's where places like museums come in, because it's museums that get us to question the socio-cultural elements that we take for granted now by telling us what happened in the past. It's about drawing attention to things that we wouldn't otherwise see, drawing attention to other cultures. And so it's organisations like museums that can really help us address things that are greenwash and understand why that greenwash works and this one doesn't, or understanding why we might see some things as greenwash or not. Sorry, I'm now passing the dog with one hand to try and calm her down. So maybe that's a good point to pass back to somebody else.
We are always welcoming of dog interruptions at Critical Conversations. Cat interruptions too, also fine. I think that's really interesting. The idea of symbolic sort of ways of communicating whether things are actually sustainable or not is quite an interesting thing. Mia, I know that a lot of your research speaks to identity and these sort of markers. I wonder whether you might want to come in at this point and speak to that.
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of the conversations that we've had have been on this idea of personal greenwashing, and I think both Sam and Lucy have started to touch on this. So yeah, I look at the role of fashion and clothing in identity, but specifically relating to politics. And I think kind of what keeps coming up and what both of you kind of seem to allude to was this idea that as much as perhaps we don't want it to be this way in 2021 when we're facing down a climate crisis, a huge part of our identity is informed by what we buy, be it what we wear or what we accessorize with, what's in our kitchen cupboards and things like that, be it, you know, a Vic tote bag, or my favorite example is always the Chili's water bottle. There is such a signifier, and it almost ties back, or in fact it does, a lot of what we're talking about ties back to kind of these ideas of wealth and ultimately class as well. And you have these very, I suppose, ethically branded items that have become signifiers of something simultaneously. So the Chili's water bottle would be one, having the tote bag from, you know, a very specific bookshop that is quite expensive and markets a very specific type of book, things like that. So I suppose the question is, how does this come back to this idea of personal greenwashing? So I think kind of where we're at in the conversation now, we're all confident in the idea of greenwashing on a corporate level. But we also do have a responsibility and a role to play as consumers. And I think it's a reciprocal relationship, and both the consumer and the large kind of multinational clothing company is equally to blame here. So we understand that these companies greenwash and that we've been putting our money into things that perhaps aren't as ethical as we thought, are deeply ambiguous even at best, and, you know, out and out terrible from an ethical and eco standpoint at worst. And we've been told time and time again that we need to buy reusable, we need to eat in a more clean way, in a green way, a more plant-based way. All of these things are true. Use your Chili's water bottle, don't buy a bottle of Evian, all of those things. And we've all, I think for a time, we've all been on board with that, and we've been more than happy to do it to whatever extent we can. And that's greater or lesser for some people than others. And again, it ties back to things like wealth and class, and also time, and how much can you commit to that in amongst all of the other things that put pressure on your day-to-day life. And then you start to realize that no matter how much you use your, you know, unbranded recyclable water bottle that you're going to keep until you're 55, ultimately part of the ocean is still on fire. We all saw those images come out earlier in the year, and it's hugely, hugely demoralizing and disheartening. And that's where people start to get cynical, right? And we've started to have this cynicism, but at the same time, everyone's scared to be the first person to say that they're deeply cynical. You can say, oh, I'm angry at Adidas, and then you lie and say that you'll never buy from Adidas again. You'll say that you've started to appreciate that H&M isn't as green as you initially thought, and their recycling clothing program actually only encourages you to be more wasteful, and the things you buy with that £10 discount end up in the same bin that you donated to in the first place in approximately 9 months. But no one wants to say this. So ultimately what you do is you continue to buy things to fix that identity of being an ethical consumer on yourself, but you're still consuming. And the more you feel that kind of cynicism, which I think from a personal perspective, at least, a lot of that time that transfers into a sort of guilt. So you put money into things that you think are a good thing to do. You're still consuming, but at some point there will be a crunch point. And I think the example that I gave that is maybe less about greenwashing in terms of clothing, but being, I don't know, a very committed vegan for kind of 6 out of 7 days of the week, and then it gets to 4 a.m. on a Saturday night and you're crying in the queue buying chicken nuggets because it's all become too much and you don't know where to turn. And I'm not saying that that's everyone at all, but these things do happen, but no one will admit to the fact they happen. So you continue to greenwash your own identity in the face of companies that you know are doing the same, and you want to be different from those companies, but how much can you do as one person? And I suppose here would be where I'd link it back to what I said originally, where there is a way that you can cynically approach this and there's an optimistic way you can approach it too. And I think both are important. And this is maybe more of the cynical side. And the question is what is our responsibility as, say, a museum or a university and institutions of education and creativity to inspire that optimism back into people? It's not just about how many tote bags we're marketing with every exhibition. It's how are we marketing these ideas to people and inspiring them to want to take those changes, because they know that there are institutions with some power, like St Andrews is a big university. It does have power, and if they're on side, then its students should feel empowered to do the same, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this idea of, yeah, as we sort of approach our end time for this conversation, which has flown by, it would be a great time to bring it back to, yeah, what can we do as a museum service? Like you say, Mia, I think, you know, there are many layers to how we can approach this, right? From the retail offer in the shop, like you say, whether it's, you know, avoiding selling 6 tote bags for each sort of thing that we do, or whether it's, you know, the more positive marketing that we can do around these issues. I would be really interested to hear what our panel members think about what our role to play in this is. Lucy or Sam, who wants to jump in?
Lucy, do you want to just? I thought one of us had to go off mute first.
So you thought you'd pass the buck to me, or are you saying that you're gonna?
Well, I mean, it's up to you. If you've got a bigger commitment to this question, then by all means. Otherwise,
not really. I can answer very briefly, but I think I guess it's coming back to Mia saying that we're confused, or we don't really know what sometimes we feel individually that there's a lot of pressure to make some choices. And one of the big things about going back to my idea of symbolism and picking on easy symbols about what it means to be environmentally sustainable is actually some of the really difficult questions and complexity around climate change, sustainability, environmental consequences. And it links back to what Sam was saying earlier, as well as we've got to have some really fundamentally big conversations about what it means to have a meaningful life. And what does it mean to be successful? And what does it mean to live in a great world? And what does it mean to be a valuable company, for example, or a valuable organisation? And those conversations aren't well represented by tote bags and water bottles, and they're not well represented perhaps by quick symbols and adverts. They are conversations that we need to have, though, if we're going to change. And that's a role that I could also see that museums and local organisations could do, is to facilitate conversations, critical conversations. There's a good name drop around these things with local people in local situations to learn about, as I said earlier, socio-cultural context, socio-cultural relations, really facilitating some of those really difficult and thoughtful and big questions that need to happen if we're going to have a proper systemic change that's going to address the climate crisis.
I think that's a really you know, important point, isn't it? That, you know, whether it's no use for us all to just go out there and buy all of the sustainable things for our house, right? I was like, I'm going to go and buy a sustainable version of this or a sustainable version of that. I'm going to clear out my wardrobe, donate everything to a charity shop that's fast fashion, and then buy sustainable clothing. That's not what it's about. It's about a change in attitude. It's about a change in what we value, a change in what these processes are, right? So Yeah, I think absolutely. That certainly strikes me that one of the best ways that we as museums can do this is, yeah, to open up avenues of conversation and let people know what these issues actually are. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually like to jump in on that one as well. And I think where museums fit in with an educational aspect, and like you said, kickstarting this conversation, I think, you know, these big issues are almost becoming equivalent to sort of dinner time taboo subjects such as sex, drugs, and money. And I think where museums have an opportunity in an educational sense is really actually to kind of push the boat out. They've been spaces to capture histories that often are otherwise not necessarily spoken about in our curriculums, and being able to take those risks as a museum, as an institution that's focusing on disseminating information, that's about kickstarting conversations and really living up to that reputation. And I think in this state of affairs, we can't really afford to play it safe anymore. And I guess on a personal point, urging that museums kind of take that risk as well. And in all honesty, it seems like the question about tote bags to a lot of people can be a little bit of like a, you know, like they're tote bags, no biggie. But honestly, people would often really underestimate how radical a step just absolutely banning tote bags and all other little knickknacks that you get that people give away or sell. Just get rid of them. Just do it, and then stick a poster up saying "shops closed." We don't do that anymore, and then, you know, invite a conversation around it. And I think just really taking chances is probably the biggest thing that can happen here.
I think that's a really interesting point. It's one of those things about, you know, we certainly as a museum are definitely trying to be bolder in what we do, trying to sort of show that museums aren't neutral spaces. I think that's one thing that's been sort of it's a common thought. I think that museums are just sort of knowledge disseminators, but actually, you know, I think increasingly in museums it's more about sort of actually getting those messages out there and empowering people to have these conversations. Mia, it'd be interesting to hear from you how you think that might sort of play into what museums do. I think certainly with the banning of tote bags, listen, the carrier bag thing worked, right? So who's to say that banning tote bags wouldn't work?
Yeah, I am now envisioning some kind of mass redistribution of all tote bags so that every single person in St Andrews only ends up with one. I don't know if that's something that Transitions would like to organise. I'd be absolutely up for that, but I'd imagine it would be a much bigger task than we think. But I suppose kind of the key point there that, again, you've all touched upon is this idea education is not neutral, and museums are a place of education. I think, yeah, Lucy, we would all end up with 10 tote bags. I completely agree. There's too many per individual. But yeah, what we're doing is never neutral, and we can try and be, I think we can be objective, we can be rational, we can be all of those things in how we, and we can also be empathetic and sensitive with that. And we've seen that in the way that we've conducted exhibitions on numerous things, like as Sam said, the taboo subjects of kind of sex, drugs and money. They're all things that are very frequent in our current exhibitions, and we obviously have Dive-In coming up as well. But you can be rational and you can be empathetic, but you can also be critical and be non-neutral, because this isn't a subject we can afford to be neutral anymore. This is something that's very urgent, and it ultimately isn't good enough to not take a stand on it at this stage, because everyone needs to take a stand, be it through their own individual actions and thinking, do I need to accept another tote bag? Do I need another jumper from the only H&M in St Andrews? Do I need a Chilly's water bottle, really? Is it something that I'm going to use for 3 weeks? Do I need those personal identity markers? But then thinking about it, are the people I'm working for doing this? And that's really hard. And it's really hard when you're a student and you're relying on the people that you work for to probably pay your fees and rent. But where you have that space or any sort of agency in your own life, because if you look critically at it, there will be somewhere in your education or your workplace, or even in your individual steps and your conversations with flatmates and friends, just taking that agency and thinking, what can I do as an individual? And you don't have to buy everything sustainable immediately if you can only afford an H&M jumper, because ultimately this is an expensive thing to do. Tote bags are cheap. Sustainable salvage jeans start at like £120. Like, it's a hard move to make. But if you say you're going to buy an H&M jumper for £7, then sew it up when it gets holes in it in 6 months. It's something small that you can do. And I think just reassessing what you can do as an individual, and then looking at the spaces that you inhabit, and even down to the museums, if you don't work in one, the museums you visit, the places where not only you choose to spend your money, but you choose to spend your time and engage with ideas, is really important. Yes, all go to transitions and get these things for free and contribute to the reuse cycle. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think it strikes me that, you know, we all have so much power as individuals to really sort of question the processes and everything that we inhabit ourselves, but also to use our voices to pressure organizations and other sort of corporations to do good. And like we say, I think there are some really fantastic takeaways there for us as a museum service around being bold, opening up these conversations, being critical, and fundamentally, I guess, not greenwashing. that is a key takeaway. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our critical conversation this evening. I'd just like to thank Lucy, Sam and Mia again for your participation. It's been such a fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for taking part. Just to let everybody know, like I said at the beginning, Dive In Protecting Our Ocean opens at the Wardlaw Museum on Friday, and we're open 7 days a week. So come along and make your climate pledge, which is very, very exciting, and tell us all about it on social media. Next month's critical conversation, we're going to be looking at positivity and positive messaging in the climate crisis, which is quite interesting because it's something we've touched upon this evening. So if you're interested in that, come back next month on, let me remember when it is, Tuesday the 9th of November. But thank you all so much for joining in, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.